whatever like me.
Sure, I think he should be free to. It's
Because
just that he's not living on campus.
Oh, okay. Of course, I've read almost all of the research papers. I have some questions to ask you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of
All right, so going live.
Sure. Because then I know
Oh, yeah.
What is supposed to happen?
Okay, so it's supposed to record. And
You're supposed to share the screen. You can also record with the cloud and later on you can download the video on your laptop and then post it on YouTube. That's all going on.
going cheaper. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
take a while. So can I check? We can.
Right, shall we?
Okay. Hey everyone, thank you for coming today on a Friday evening. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. My name is Grish, and today I'll be talking about something that I've been doing for quite a while and I'm super interested in. So hopefully by the end of this talk, I'll get you people interested in it as well. So this talk I gave it previously at Ieee-Nus Hackers. So I've kind of repurposed the slides, added a bit more stuff that's relevant to you as kind of like a majority engineering student population. So we'll see how it goes. So a bit about me, I do this. I'm a research student at Ieee-Nus Computing. I do CS. I do this thing called geometric deep learning, mainly for like, the biochem applications. I'll get to that very soon. So right now I'm interning at I2R, which is the Institute for Infocom Research. I think that's what it stands for. I write about this sort of machine learning stuff, graph stuff, and I like open source. So if you want to check out my profile, use that link. Okay, so let me just get like a brief sensing. How many of you are freshmen? Year twos? Year threes? Okay, majority. Okay, so clearly you've heard of this, probably heard. Okay, how many of you have heard about this thing called the graph? Just a graph, right? So to those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll just give like a quick recap. So, there are a lot of things around us that are connected in some way. To very simply represent them, we can use this thing called a graph. In traditional computer science or math, it's this data structure that can represent entities. So what does that mean? So in a social media graph, you, me, we'd be nodes for these circles. And suppose I follow you and you follow me back. We can draw an edge between the nodes, and that just shows that you and I, we have some sort of relationship. So in a social media graph, that would mean me following you, you following me. In the case of a molecule, if we represent the nodes as atoms, the edges would obviously be the type of bond. So you can just say that, okay, two atoms, if they have an edge between them, that means they're probably connected, or they have a bond between them. So you have some edge relationship between the nodes of these different entities. So just 2 weeks ago, there's like this really famous researcher at DeepMind called Petar Veličković, and he released this very interesting paper called "Everything is Connected." And it's true. A lot of the things you see around us in nature, they are graphs. If you model them like that, if you can formulate something like a graph in the real world, it probably exists. So I want to show you through the course of this presentation, I want to show you some different applications, some really cool things that have been going on in the world of graph deep learning. The moral of the story is you can represent anything as a graph. So yeah, so you have social media. In fact, this is like a screenshot I took from my work that I do at A-Star. It's a protein, and that itself can be represented as a graph. We have our own MRT system. That's a graph. Every station is a node, and the train lines on the edges. There's been a lot of research in mapping the brain. So the brain, the neurons, if you take them as nodes, and the neuronal pathways, they are your edges. And of course, you have like these tiny molecules. Your atoms again are nodes, and edges are bonds. So sure, we can represent things as graphs, but what can we do on those graphs? You can use them. You can mine information from these graph data structures, the things that they represent. For example, DeepMind released a paper about 2 years ago, and it actually gives you ETA prediction on how long you'll take from from a source to a destination. Some people may have heard of Pinterest, the company. They are using graph neural networks to model recommendation systems to give you the content you want to see. Amazon also does quite a bit of graph deep learning when it comes to recommending content to you, things that they want you to buy, books that they want you to buy on Amazon, on the Amazon bookstore, that sort of thing. And of course, Uber Eats. So let's go back to this traditional graph. If you take classes like CS 2040, right, they just tell you that a graph is a bunch of nodes and edges. That's about it. You can represent probably some road network, and that's where it ends. I want to show you that you can actually do a lot more with the graph. You can encode so much more information on this graph that will help you make predictions or mine this graph. So as with traditional machine learning, your entities, your nodes can have features. So we call these node features. And of course, optionally, your edges can have information tagged to them as well. So if you take all the node features, you can actually stack it into this like a matrix looking thing. So of course, each node has its own representation. So in the case of a social media graph, that would mean every node is a user, and the node features would be something that's particular to the user, something like their date of birth, their, Twitter bio, their political leaning, that sort of stuff. And you can kind of create some sort of vector or embedding and use that to represent all the nodes and edges. So of course, we have, now that we've understood the notion of the graph and how we can encode information, there are different types of problems that you can model as a graph and then do graph deep learning on that graph. So for instance, you can do this thing called node prediction. That means I give you a node, you're going to predict some sort of class or some label to it. So in the case of a molecule, if I say, hey, these are all the chemical properties, what atom is it? Then you'd say, okay, no, it's a hydrogen, it's a carbon, it's an oxygen atom. Next, you have this thing called edge prediction, type 1. And it's essentially asking a very simple question of, given two nodes, should this edge exist? And this is pretty common in places like LinkedIn, where you're trying to recommend someone to follow. So you're simply asking, should these two people be connected in the first place? Should an edge exist between them? So the next type of edge prediction is, edge prediction type 2. And that's really asking, okay, if an edge exists between them, what's the weight or what's the value associated with that weight? So of course, this edge weight can represent different things. In the case of a molecule, like the bond itself, you can have a single bond, double bond, and a triple bond, and you can encode that sort of information on the edge. And of course, the final type is, whole graph classification or whole graph prediction. If I give you a molecule, is that entire thing toxic? Is it soluble? Right? So that would mean looking at the entire graph and then classifying it or giving it some label. So now, we've gone through the 4 types of problems that mostly occur in graph deep learning. Of course, there are many more, but fundamentally, you can boil all of them into those 4 types as well. So this is what I'm going to be doing. This is how I've structured the presentation. I'll be going through some very cool applications of GNNs or graph neural networks. I'll be giving you kind of like a good summary of how the real world, people in the real world use graphs for their problems. So I've taken some very cool case studies across the field of, the engineering, the sciences, and computer science, kind of combine them together, and hopefully you'll understand that any problem you have right now can be formulated as a graph. So first, let's begin with something very something that all of us have used in some form: Google Maps. CS 2040, those kind of mods, they tell you that, hey, you can use a graph to represent a road network. The nodes are probably the junctions, and the edges of the pathways between those junctions. So Google actually does something very similar. So let's take this screenshot from Google Maps just outside SOC. So Google Computing is somewhere over here, and that is the one path. So this is the road network that we see in real life. And if we had to convert this into some sort of graph, you can easily see that. Let's break it up into some form of road segment. So you have these road segments, it's colored blocks. For example, you can say that, a road segment is anything that's 10 meters or less, right? Or some arbitrary number. I'll just move this out of the way. Yeah. So road networks are made of road segments, and you can take those road segments and represent them as individual nodes, and then you just go one step further and connect them all. So you went from this situation where you have all your road segment nodes. If you draw lines between them, you're going to get a graph that looks something like this. Of course, you can also represent information on that road itself. For example, what is the length of the road? How quick can you go on that road, like speed limits and whatever. So of course, you have these edge features and your node features, as with any graph problem. So that DeepMind paper that I mentioned that came out 2 years ago, they do this thing called ETA prediction. So that would mean we can classify it as an edge prediction type 2 task, really asking what is the weight of the existing edge, and this weight represents the travel time across that road. So if I have a road that's about 20 meters, maybe my ETA prediction algorithm will say it'll take me 5 seconds to traverse it using some average road speed that you can input. So your total expected time of arrival at your destination would be the sum of all the times across all the edges. So all the road segments, how long you'll take to traverse all of that. So we also need to remember that Google has a lot of data stored when it comes to maps, traffic patterns, so they can make use of that information and get you node features and edge features. So that could be road length, how long is it in terms of meters, road priority. Sometimes, you'd want to go across a highway to get from place A to B compared to like a narrow alleyway. You'd also have historical data on the average travel speeds from all the kind of cars that have used Google Maps across the years, and it kind of logs that information. And of course, you can also have information from different times of the day. So this would mean, during the non-peak hours, your cars would move a bit slowly, and during peak hours, they would be even slower because traffic and whatnot. So when you take all these features and then you combine them into or when you encode the road segment nodes and edges with this information, you get a road segment graph or a road network graph. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be very relevant soon. Okay, yeah. So this is in the case of ETA prediction. Now I've shown you how to take ETA prediction and make it a graph problem. Now let's move on to another very interesting application, which is in the whole realm of biochemistry or drug discovery and medicine. So you have all these cool companies that are listed here. They make use of graph deep learning pretty heavily in designing drugs. So consider molecules of all shapes and sizes. There's this thing called adenine. In fact, it's one of the bases in your DNA. You have this thing called aminobenzoic acid, and it's a drug that's used to treat arthritis. Next, you have synephrine, and it's used to treat shock patients. And finally, you have this thing called mandelic acid, and it's used in your skincare, like your moisturizers and your lotions and toners. So what you can do is take all of these molecules and you can represent them as a graph. So that means, again, your atoms are the nodes and your bonds are the edges. So if you have this adenine molecule, you can represent it as an adenine graph. And if you have this, I think it's aminobenzoic acid or mandelic acid, you can again represent this as a molecule graph. So then you can ask questions like, okay, is this molecule toxic? Is this molecule soluble? Of course, if you take moisturizer and put it in water, it's not like it's going to dissolve, right? So you can actually predict its solubility if you know its molecular structure like this. And of course, you need to train it in some way, but we'll get to that shortly. So when we look at the field of biochemistry, this one would be a whole graph prediction task, right? You take a graph as your input and all you need to do is predict some label to it. Either this could be a binary yes or no, or you could give it some sort of real value. So in fact, there's this whole group of people very interested in this thing called molecular property prediction. So if I give you a molecule, you need to predict a real value number, which represents something, which could represent the solubility of the molecule. So you can do any sort of thing with that molecule graph. Another very interesting thing is this thing called graph generation. How do I go from nothing to a whole molecular structure? So that would mean combining your node prediction on whether this node should exist or not, whether this atom should be part of the graph or not, and edge prediction type 1, which is, should this edge exist between two nodes or not? So that means, should an edge or a bond exist between an atom? So when you combine those two tasks, again, you get this very cool task called graph generation, but I'll only briefly touch upon it. So what about, the features? You have a molecule. How do you represent it in terms of its graph features? Usually this is obtained using very computationally expensive molecular dynamics simulations, which means they run a whole bunch of equations and get the coordinates of the atoms in 3D space. So you can use things like atomic number of the atom, the bond type, is it a single, double, or triple bond? And you can access information from domain knowledge. You can ask the scientists and they'll tell you, oh yeah, you can use a whole bunch of other numbers to represent a node and an edge in the molecule. So like the solubility, how much does it like water, which is this aqua affinity, energy of the molecule as potential energy and kinetic energy. Torsion angles are basically, you have your bond over here. How many degrees of freedom does that bond have when moving in 3D space? And you have many other things like patient bodily conditions, right? Are they diabetic? Do they have some disease? And you need your drug molecule to act in a specific way. You can encode all of that information in your graph. So now that we've gone from ETA prediction to biochemistry, now I'm going to take you to this thing called chip design. All of these companies are doing something related to chip design. And chip is like the printed circuit board, which I'm pretty sure like most of you are acquainted with. So let's go to the very traditional way of designing a printed circuit board or PCB. There's like these industry grade desktop applications that you need to download, and you need to create this thing called a netlist. And a netlist is, it's basically this thing, this green canvas on which you design your circuit board. You need to put all the components, your heat sinks, your resistors, a whole bunch of other components, connect them in some way that makes sense so that they can execute whatever you want them to execute in terms of the logic. And finally, you go send it to the shop and they'll actually make this physically and deliver it to you. That takes a very, very long time because that would mean meticulously looking at every component and seeing, okay, within that component, you have all those pins, which pin is connected to the other pin of another component. And that usually takes months for PCB fabrication. So you can technically represent this as a graph as well, right? You can take all of these pin information, you can represent them as nodes, and anything that's supposed to be connected on the circuit board, you can represent it as an edge. So that would mean, okay, when I power up my circuit board, electricity would flow along all the edges between all the components that are connected here. So you can go one step further. You might be familiar with this concept of the adjacency matrix, which basically takes this funky looking graph node and edge, and you assign them with indexes like 1, 2, 3, 4. You basically label the nodes, and everywhere that it's red, it just means node 3 is connected to node 4, or node 2 is connected to node 1. And of course, it's a symmetric matrix because it's an undirected graph, meaning if I connect one component to the other, that other component is also connected to me. So there's like a bidirectional flow. But of course, you don't need to be undirected depending on the situation. So yeah, so you take this netlist and you are able to convert it into a graph, and that really simplifies things, as I'll show you very soon. So, okay. So when we have the netlist graph, that would again be a whole graph prediction task. You're trying to see which components are supposed to be connected to each other, which pins of those components need to be connected to each other, and then you actually need to go and connect them. So again, it's a very simple yes and no question in terms of existence. Should this connection exist or not? And this again goes back to the whole graph generation, very big task, which can be boiled down to these two subtasks. So if we look at a case study a few years ago, Google Research actually took the netlist graph. They built this whole machine learning model. And if you look at that tiny corner over there, the red square, there's this thing called the graph convolution, which I'll get to very shortly. It's one of the very fundamental algorithms. It's very simple to understand. And if you notice so far, I haven't shown you any equations, any math, right? It's simply because graphs are that easy to understand, that for graph neural networks, as you'll see, they're pretty easy to understand. You don't need the math and the equations to understand what they're doing. As long as you have the intuition, when you see the equation, you'll be like, okay, yeah, I know what's happening. So yeah, so you take that graph convolution, you run it on that netlist graph, and then you can get some sort of representation from it. So what they do is, so you start off with a blank canvas over there, and by combining it with this other thing called reinforcement learning, which I'll not get into, you can actually start placing components like these black squares on that canvas, and you can start connecting them until you get something that looks like a finished printed circuit board. But there are also some constraints. You want to minimize the amount of wires you use or the amount of circuitry, because that costs money. And if you minimize the amount of material you use, but still getting that logic thing done, that's a win-win situation. So this is like a very cool case study on how they used graphs to represent chips. So now we've gone from learning what a graph is to then learning how to take a problem and decompose it into a graph problem. All you need to know, or all you need to ask yourself is, what do the nodes represent and what do the edges represent? And if you're taking mods like CS2040, you're kind of familiar with that process. It's just that now your nodes have node features, your edges have edge features, depending on the context. So we've gone through formulation and data, but what about the model, right? Earlier I mentioned this thing called the graph neural network. It sounds scary, but it's actually very straightforward. This model, the graph neural network, this is what we're going to use to train on that graph that we've created from the problems we've covered. So, okay, so let's go back to this situation. When your graphs have node features and edge features, we like to call it an attributed graph, which means that your nodes have attributes or features, they're all synonyms, and your edges might have features or attributes. So we call this entire thing an attributed graph. So now let's kind of zoom in to this purple node in the center. So if you look at its immediate neighbors, the thing that it's immediately connected to, if you look here, it would be that yellow node there, the orange, the darker purple, and the red. So you just kind of take that and we just zoom into that central purple node. So what happens now is this whole thing, this red, purple, orange, and yellow, nodes collectively, we call it the neighborhood of the graph. So you can call this center node as some node I, and everything around it that it's connected to, you can call it its neighborhood. So you can think of it as the friends of any node. So now we do this thing called message passing, right? So you have all your friends around you, And what they do is they take their node features and send it towards the target node. The node is the center. So that would mean, let's say that I have, M&Ms with me, the chocolate, and let's say I have 3 friends. They have a Hershey's, a Mars bar, and a Twix. So now what happens in message passing is they take some of their chocolate and they give it to me. The Hershey's, the Mars bar, and the Twix, they give it to me, the guy with the M&Ms. And what I do then, so this process is called aggregation, the process of aggregating my friends' features, their chocolate in some way. So this is called an aggregation function. Next, what I want to do is take all of my neighbors, like their node features, and I want to combine them in some way. So that would mean taking the 3 types of chocolate, putting it in a bowl, mixing it all together. So now I have their collected, aggregated features. And so we call this the message or the messages. So what happens is your neighbors send you their messages and you kind of combine them in some way using some aggregation function. And it could be as simple as adding up all your neighbors' features. So next, what we want to do is we want to update that target node's features in the stage called the update phase or the readout phase, as some papers call it. So that would mean taking my M&Ms, taking that bowl of all the mixed chocolate from my friends and combining those 2 together. And now I just have like this kind of sludge looking thing that contains M&Ms, Twix, Mars bars, and Hershey's. So you can think of that as the update step. So now that final bowl, that is my new node feature. That is my new representation that I'm going to carry on with. So yeah, this is called the G over here is the aggregation function, and F is the update function. So you can see that I take my own features, my friends' features, and I get my new features. So, I mean, of course, you can also do this with an edge. So if your edges have edge features associated with them, you can just, pass in the two nodes at the edges. So the ends of the edge, you can pass in the edge feature as well. Combine all of that and you get the new edge feature. So now we've only looked at message passing for a specific target node. What happens with GNNs is that you can parallelize everything. You can have all of that happening at one shot. So that means for every node, you look at all its friends and you just take the friends' features, combine it with your own. And that's one layer or one round of message passing, which corresponds to a single GNN layer. So now, you might be wondering, where do all the weights, machine learning, it all has to do with weights. Where are the weights? So if I go back to these functions like T, F, and G, you can think of F and G as neural networks themselves. They take all of these things, the summed up neighbor messages, I kind of maybe concatenate it with my own, pass it through kind of like a multi-layer perceptron. It could be like a very simple single layer, and those are where the weights are contained. Yeah. So when you do all of that, it corresponds to a single GNN layer, which corresponds to one round of message passing for every single node in the graph. So essentially, if you take one round of message passing or a single GNN layer, you can actually stack them up one on top of each other, as you do with regular machine learning neural network layers. You stack them to build a deeper network. So that would mean doing one round of message passing, another round of message passing, and another, until you get like a 3-layer graph neural network. And at every layer, you're doing the same thing, looking at my friends' features, taking it, combining it with my own. So yeah, so this is like a very intuitive refinement process. You start off with your initial node features, social media graph, that would be like my Twitter bio, my date of birth, whatever. Then you pass it through the GNN, and those numbers will be slightly different, or they'll be updated, and they'll really represent me as a person on that social media graph, for example. So in essence, that entire thing that I quickly just went through, that's a graph neural network. It just boils down to 2 very simple steps. Collect my friends' information, mix it with my own, and just keep doing that again and again, and you get richer representation, richer embeddings richer vectors that represent each node and edge. So again, now we go back to what we have with us in our recipe, right? We have our formulation and the data, and we have the model being the graph neural network. So what exactly does that mean when I have everything with me? That means I take the model and apply it on my graph that I've created, or the attributed graph that I've created. So when I apply this model on the graph, then you can train it in the same way that you train any other neural network. You can use something like gradient descent, and your typical losses like mean squared error, depending on the situation you're in. Of course, if you're doing like a node prediction, that would be a yes or no. You could use something like cross entropy and get it over with. So you can train this entire thing in an end-to-end fashion, as we like to call it, which means that I don't need to introduce any extra algorithms or extra methods to train this thing. It's very similar to traditional machine learning or traditional deep neural networks. So now you're probably wondering, okay, cool, what is it that this GNN or graph neural network can do that my typical multi-layer perceptron cannot do? So that's where we get to the benefits of GNN. The fact that the GNN is looking at a node with respect to all its friends, all its neighbors, that means your GNN really understands the structure of the graph. It really understands that, okay, these sort of nodes are connected to this other sort of node. So for example, in a social media graph, if I am a Democrat, for example, that means I would follow friends who are also possibly Democrats, maybe an occasional Republican here or two, but I would mainly associate with the Democrats. So your GNN will understand that those sort of affiliations, the associations between the nodes and the edges. So it's really a thing of knowing your neighbors to really know yourself. And the fact that you do message passing, you take your neighbors' information, that means your own information is mixed with theirs. So we also generate this thing called neighbor-informed features that just is a fancy way of saying, I know my friends know me. And this is why the structural understanding is why a GNN is much better for these sort of graph-related problems or anything that can be formulated as a graph compared to a multi-layer perceptron or any basic non-graph neural network that ignores structure completely. So if we go back to that ETA prediction thing that I was showing you earlier, right? You have map of the world. That ETA prediction model that DeepMind built, it's actually being used on your phones right now as you speak. They rolled out an update a few years ago. And across around the world, you can see major improvements in all like the global hubs, right? You have New York, California, London, Japan, and you have us in Singapore, you have a 31% improvement in or accuracy in predicting your ETA. So now you actually know how long you'll take going from one place to the other. Now let's look at it in the whole case of biochemistry, right? Drug discovery. So this, this weird green red looking thing, that is what we call a ligand, L-I-G-A-N-D, and that's the drug molecule. So if you swallow a pill, that pill is just choked full of that molecule that looks like that. And that white cloud looking thing, that's a protein. And the purpose of a drug, every time you swallow a drug, like a tablet or a syrup, what happens is like the molecules inside that tablet, they go to that specific target location, and then they get into the cell. The cell is choked full of proteins of interest, and then they go and sit on top of that protein, and they either strengthen it or they want to kill it in some way. So if it's a viral protein, you want to kill it. But if it's something that actually boosts your immunity, you want to force that protein to produce more of that type of cell that causes the good immunity. So that's kind of like a quick biochem intro. So what we're interested in is this thing called protein docking, where we want to see how exactly that ligand molecule, the drug molecule, goes and sits on the protein. So you can see a whole bunch of like orientations over, this pink thing, this red and green, these blue things. The green color over here and here, it represents the real drug position. People have actually conducted real life experiments in the labs, and they tell us, okay, look, this paracetamol drug molecule, it goes and sits on some protein this specific way. Now, what we're trying to do is predict. We're trying to predict these dynamics on, okay, I give you an arbitrary drug molecule, how would it go and sit where it's supposed to sit? So as you can see over here, my red color over here, it's the predicted drug position. And compared to all of this other stuff, that pink thing and the blue stuff, my red prediction is like way closer to the real drug position or the real binding or the docking position than all the other methods. And that's because of graph deep learning. A new method was released just last year that does this. Yeah, so it's called DiffDock, and what we're doing is predicting the docking or the way that a ligand, a drug molecule, goes and sits on a protein. So in fact, they ran this and they trained this model, and of course you can see that that's like the unrealistic stuff, and the red thing is the more real-looking thing. And what happens is that now we were able to achieve something, 38% realistic positions when it comes to how that prediction goes and sits on the protein. And okay, you might be thinking like 38%, kind of like a failing grade. Why is it so great? It's pretty great when everything that came before it only was reaching about 20%. So because of that graph understanding, that 3D graph understanding that came with the use of very special handcrafted graph neural networks, you suddenly get a boost in performance. And now, that sort of thing is being used in labs and by bioinformatics people around the world. So now that we've covered, the sort of advances on a map from something as simple as like the apps that we use every single day to something that's being used by pharmaceutical companies in making very good, high efficacy drugs, the role of graphs and graph neural networks is pretty unparalleled, especially when you compare them to their counterparts that don't care about the structure of anything. They just predict, and most times they're wrong. So yeah, I'm giving you like a good understanding of what's been happening. This is like the latest and greatest research that's come out in the past 2 years. And 2 years in the machine learning field, it's actually a long time. A lot can happen within the span of 2 years. And these are some of the very cool stuff that's happened right last year. So now I've spoken about the past. What happens in the future? How exactly are we using this graph deep learning? How are we taking it to the next level? So all this while we've been dealing with 2D graphs. So in the case of your Google Maps, that's a 2D map, right? I mean, it's a flat road and all you need to do is travel along that flat road. What happens now is you're moving into like those kind of biochemistry applications where you're looking at 3D graphs. Molecules aren't 2D, they're 3D. And because of that, you need that 3D understanding, that spatial understanding to understand or to analyze how certain drugs bind to proteins, how different proteins interact with each other. And when we're able to do that, that just means better healthcare, better drug discovery, and that really speeds up the process of pushing something from the lab to the market. Next, we've all come across these very classical graph problems like shortest path algorithms. And that's cool and all for tiny graphs. You can use your breadth first search, your depth first search. But if I scale my graph to millions of nodes, your BFS and your DFS is going to break down. It's probably going to give you it's going to take 2 months before it gives you an answer. This is where GNNs come into the picture. There's this entire field of algorithmic reasoning where we're training graph neural networks on these classical tasks, and we're expecting them to come up with things like shortest paths. So in fact, a very interesting problem studied by the community is the traveling salesman problem, which means, okay, given a whole graph, how can I go to every city on a graph and visit it once and then come back to where I started from? And you need to do this in the shortest amount of time or the shortest distance. So a lot of GNNs have been trained on the TSP, and for large graphs with 10,000, 100,000, million nodes, we can get a prediction in less than 10 seconds. And even the largest, the most powerful classical algorithm, it's called Concord. It was developed by University of Waterloo. It takes 2 months to give you a prediction for the TSP on a very large graph. So that's like a huge speed up from 2 months all the way to like a few seconds. Next, we're really moving beyond graphs in isolation. We want to know how two proteins interact. We want to know how two users interact, right? This is where we're taking two different types of graphs and seeing how the nodes there interact. And for that, you would again need a very special family of graph neural networks so that they can model both those type of graphs. So if you go back to that biochemistry setting, you have your drug molecule graph and you have your protein graph. So that's a very clear example of two different types of graphs coming together and doing something in your body. So we want to also capture that sort of thing. But of course, these GNNs, they aren't perfect. They have a whole bunch of limitations. These things called oversmoothing and oversquashing. Oversmoothing is a term that's given to a situation where you do too much message passing and all your features start looking the same. In fact, if you kind of trace out by hand the message passing algorithm, the fact that I'm taking my friends' information, mixing it with my own, if we go back to that chocolate analogy, after a while, all our bowls are going to start looking the exact same in terms of the composition. We're just all going to have this sludge that's just meaningless, right? How can I taste all of it and know which one contains which chocolate anymore? So that problem is called oversmoothing. Then there's this thing called oversquashing. When I have a very long graph with a long diameter, that just means the shortest path between two graphs is very, very long. How do I take information from one end of the graph and send it to another node on the other end of the graph? If you think of it in terms of a signal, if I'm able to scream your name at this distance, you'll probably be able to hear me. But if you go stand 1 kilometer away and I scream your name, you might hear a very faint sound or you might not hear anything at all. So that just means these long range interactions, it's difficult to capture them with the traditional message passing style graph neural networks. So a lot of work is being done to understand these theoretical problems and solve them using the theory. Of course, that would require you to understand like the heavy math involved, but for like an introductory talk, you can clearly see that you've already more or less understood GNNs without seeing any equations. So some of the, I guess, disclaimers of this talk is that I watered down a lot of things, and because of that, there's a whole lot of complexity involved that I'm kind of hiding away. That the scientists actually did the hard work of figuring out and abstracted it away from the user. So all these topics that I've covered, they're topics that are being studied right now. None of it is solved in any way. We're still looking for solutions out there that does something better, faster. And the third point is something that I really want to emphasize on, the whole importance of engineering when it comes to solving these big problems. In fact, that ETA prediction work by DeepMind, it was an engineering problem. How do you take the graph neural network, deploy it somewhere so that everybody gets to access that model pretty quickly, especially in areas with a very bad cellular reception, right? That all goes back to an engineering and infrastructure problem. Even when it comes to the biochemistry stuff, sure, I can design a drug on my computer. How do I actually go make it in real life into a tablet? That, again, involves quite a bit of engineering thinking. And yeah, problem formulation, taking an existing problem and showcasing it in the form of a graph, that requires a bit of thinking too on what the nodes represent and what the edges represent. And this is just a comic that my friend sent me. You can read it. Everyone is saying everything is something, and I want to say everything is a graph. The punchline worked better than US hackers talk. Yeah, so with that, I come to an end for my supposedly lengthy presentation, just under an hour. Yeah, I'd love to take any questions. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Hey, yeah, go.
Could you go back to the slide?
Yeah.
Can you explain again what oversquashing is? You mentioned that you consider a situation where the nodes are very far apart.
Mm-hmm.
So what part of that is like does the squashing?
Okay, so that like a marker? I think I can just draw the problem and immediately, okay. Okay, so now let's say I have a node over here, let's call it node I, right? And now let's say that there's like just a single edge and it's connected to this really dense graph over here. This is like a whole bunch of nodes over here. Okay. Now, if I'm doing message processing from the perspective of this node, this edge, Eij, it's under a lot of pressure to take information from this very huge community and send it to me. So that means, let's say that you have this huge community of 100 nodes. You're taking those 100 nodes worth of information and you're stuffing it all into like a single message vector. And usually, vector sizes in machine learning, like 128, 256, 512, 1024, right? You can make it as large as you want, but you'll still lose a lot of information. So you're taking a lot of information and trying to stuff it into like a very tiny space. It's like taking an elephant and trying to stuff it into a fridge, taking that fridge and then giving it to me over here. So the squashing refers to the fact that you're taking a lot of information, squashing it into like this tiny message vector during the message passing, and then updating your node features with this thing. It's going to be very lossy. A lot of signal is lost. So this problem is called oversquashing.
Because I was thinking if you allow for floating point, like decimals basically, that would be able to account for the amount of information. But you're saying that for super large communities of nodes, even with floating point decimals, that's not going to be accounted for.
Yeah, think about it, right? Even your floating point, and you have at the end of the day, you have very limited precision, right? You can't keep going, keep going on. So that means even all of this information, think about it, all of these nodes have vectors, real numbered vectors as their features.
Right.
You're taking all of that stuff, right? For example, neighbor 1, neighbor 2, all the way till neighbor 100. And of course, all of this is some d-sized vector. You're combining them all to create one singular vector, taking that vector and sending it to me. So think of this as all your chocolate bars of different brands, combining it into one single bowl of kind of like a mixture, giving me this mixture. How can I tell which chocolate came from whom?
Oh, okay.
And that happens when you have very large communities. We call, so when many nodes are connected to each other, we call it a community. That's like a jargon thing.
Yeah.
When you have a huge community and you want that information from the community to be sent to a single node with only a single, maybe just maybe very few connections compared to this thing. If this has 1,000 edges, if it's only 3, how do you take all this information and squash it to this node here?
So it's difficult to know the structure of that community.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. So when we look at the structure of the graph itself, so oversquashing is a structural issue because of this really lame looking graph structure, which by the way appears quite a lot in nature. It's a structural issue, and because of that, your GNN, if it starts oversquashing on that graph, then what even is the point? Oversmoothing is more of the contents of the node, the content of my chocolate bowl at each node, all of them start looking the same. So if all the nodes start looking the same, if I had to pass node U and node V through my GNN, they're probably going to get the same prediction. But then U and V are not the same. So that's when oversmoothing starts becoming a problem.
Okay, thanks.
There was another question from someone there. In the white jacket.
Yeah, so one of the reports again is that global neural network.
So okay, yeah. So let's look at a normal neural network. You have your data. Everyone can see this, right? Yeah. Okay. You have your data set, right? This is your data set X. Each row corresponds to a different thing. So let's say that this is a data set of images. That means each row corresponds to like pixel values of your images. So now when you take this and pass it through a multi-layer perceptron or like a very simple neural network, there's no way of finding out, you know, you can label them 1, 2, 3, all the way till some n. There's no way of relating x1 with x2. It's all treated independently. But in a graph, the fact that things are connected to each other, you can't see them in isolation. You can't see them individually. You need to relate both of them together, which is why message passing is the framework that's commonly used. Yeah. So the fact that we're respecting the structure of the graph and not just throwing it away, that's when GNNs start to really kind of show their power. At the end of the day, your GNN, if you have a graph where where no nodes are connected, this just kind of goes back to this situation where each of them x1, x2, x3, x4. Since none of these nodes are connected to anything, they have no friends, no neighbors, your GNN basically collapses to a multi-layer perceptron naturally. But it's the fact that, you know, these connections, these relationships matter in these sort of application areas. That's when we need to account for structure when making predictions.
So when you say that the neural network is a subset of the graph.
So you're saying whether this is a subset of a GNN?
Yes.
You can think of the multi-layer perceptron as a very extreme case of a graph with no edges. Because I'm just treating everything in isolation, nothing is connected, the relationships don't matter. I only message pass to my neighbors, but I don't have any neighbors. It's like I'm living in the middle of nowhere. Who am I supposed to talk to, right? So that means there's no, so that means you take your feature x1, pass it through like the weights. So that would be just like what? Wx1 plus b, and that's it. This is nothing, there's no different from what MLP does anyway. That's only if you consider an edge between them. So your message passing only occurs when there's an edge between two nodes. I mean, the fact that we call them neighbors means that we're connected in some way. Otherwise, all of these, I mean, kind of like graph theory jargon, if there's no edges over here, all the nodes, they're called islands. Is that clear, or is there anything else I can? Yeah. So I guess like long story short, right? A multi-layer perceptron can be thought of as a graph, as a graph neural network that works on a graph with no edges. And when there's no edges, message passing can't occur. Whose features do I take? Right? If I don't know who's connected to whom, I don't know whose information to take. So you're just treating everyone in isolation, passing it through the weights and the biases, and you're just going to get like, you know, the next layer output. And that's no different from what NLP does. It takes this row, does the wx1 plus b, it takes this row and, you know, wx2 plus b. And of course, you know, you parallelize it so it happens all at once. But it's not like I'm considering the relationships between these different instances in your data set. But I'm doing it in a graph for you.
Can you say that like each window are connected to each other?
So that's a very good question you raised, because I want to show you why the graph convolution is called the graph convolution. So let's say, you know, we have an image X, and a CNN, all it does is it looks at this tiny window and you just kind of slide that window, right? If you look at the pixels of the image, they form this thing called the grid graph, right? So that means pixel number 1 is connected to pixel number 2, 3, and, you know, of course, you're going to get this grid looking thing, like the square. And each intersection is a single pixel node. So what your convolution is doing is you're looking at, if you look at this node in the center, you're looking at all its neighboring pixels. I'm sure you can also connect these diagonals, taking their pixel values, sending it towards the target pixel and updating that target pixel, which is why your convolution operator of W star X, it's like that summation of each one. So each of these numbers with the weight value in each of the filters. So a convolutional neural network is a type of GNN on a grid graph. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, what about probabilistic graphical models? Are they the same thing as well?
So probabilistic graph models, that's when you're, so you have nodes. These nodes represent states that you can be in. The edges between them, they actually, remember the node, sorry, edge prediction type 2. We're trying to see what is the weight along that edge, right? So now each of these edges, their edge features, they're just single probabilities within 0 and 1. So now all we're trying to say is, how do I go from one state S to like this other state S prime? But this one, I mean, yeah, you can model it as it is a graph, right? It is a graph problem. But it's more of why would you want to use a GNN? As in, I'm not asking this rhetorically, it's a design question you need to ask this. So the probabilistic graph model, the PGM, it is a graph. It's just that the nodes and the edges represent different things. So by all means, use a GNN if you feel like doing that whole, taking your neighbor's information, updating my own, that sort of concept. If it makes sense in your application, by all means, go ahead. Any other questions? Hey, yeah.
I was wondering if you have any recommendations for like maybe paper, book, or hopefully you focus on the mathematical theory or maybe the application for the design. I thought that was quite interesting.
Read my blog post. Okay, here's the thing. When it comes to graph machine learning, graph deep learning, compared to NLP, computer vision, it's a very, very new area, right? Computer vision, NLP, it's been done for like ages, but graph stuff, it's only been happening since like 2006, 2013. It's very young. So honestly, you like a quick Google search will reveal quite a lot of resources, blog posts, introductory articles. In fact, this is really just like a shameless plug, but if you go to my website, I have like a tab called blog posts or blogs, I don't remember. And you go there, there's going to be an article called The Math Behind GNNs. It's like this whole 30-minute long reading. It's all just math, if you're interested in it. But don't worry, the math is not scary because I accompany it with visuals like diagrams and drawings. So you'll understand what each equation means, what each symbol or notation thing means in context. So it's not scary, or at least I've been told it's not scary. Yeah. So that's kind of like that's like the quickest example I can give you for like a resource if you want to get into it. And the more you start reading about this topic, the more doubts you'll have and the more Googling you'll do. And that's when you'll start getting introduced to all these papers and extra material written by other people. Yeah. And yeah, let's call it a night. Yeah. All right, thank you.